I do couples intensives. So we're not going to just show up for 15 minutes. We're going to take several hours. I like to get at least six, but if people can only do three, we'll do three. I will spend the first half just getting to know each of their individual stories. And I want them to hear their partner tell me their story while they're there. So they're listening to it as I'm asking the question so they can start to hear their partner's story in a whole new light. We have to become experts in our partner's story if we want to understand them. And so part of what that does is it's going to help them make sense of how their partner is showing up. And they're going to take so many things less personally when they can hear in context why they would do that, why they keep repeating the same patterns. They start to have so much more empathy for each other. That's not where we stop, but that's definitely where we start.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Truth That Heals podcast. I'm here with Elle. Elle, welcome to the Truth That Heals podcast. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you for having me.
So I connected with Elle. I connected with you over Threads. It's the new Twitter that's out there. It's connected with Instagram. So it's so awesome to connect with people over new means of social media with Threads. So thank you for being here on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I saw what you said on Threads, and I was really curious. You were asking a question about how people find healing with truth, and I immediately gravitated towards that post.
Well, thank you for connecting. And before we really even get started and diving into the hard stuff, can you share a bit about yourself and what it is that you currently do?
Yes, I am a psychotherapist in Maine and New Hampshire. I also work online as a story coach and a somatic mind body coach, and I have a podcast called The Phoenix Effect.
So amazing. So you have your therapy going on, you have your podcast, but I like to get to know each guest a little bit better. So before we get into the podcast, the Phoenix podcast, I would like to get to understand a little bit about your background with therapy. Can you share with us how did that all start?
Yes. Well, I was really interested in psychology growing up. It was discouraged from my parents because that was a very foreign concept, but I couldn't kill the interest. And so I got my degree in counseling psychology, but I took a break after I graduated and I was a stay-at-home mom for 8 years. And then I started working towards licensure. And after I completed licensure, I was trying to pick an area I wanted to specialize in. And my supervisor and all of these well-meaning people around me were giving me their ideas of what they thought would be the best way for me to pursue a certification. But none of it felt quite right. They all sounded like great ideas, but I was like paralyzed with indecision. And I started listening to this podcast, and I'm like, wait a minute, I want to do it like he does it. And so I found out what his training was. And so I pursued a certification in narrative focused trauma care with the Allender Center. And it changed how I do therapy and how I came about my own healing work.
So can you give a breakdown of what is narrative focused trauma or
Yeah, I know, right?
yeah.
Long title. Narrative focused trauma care. It is an interesting way to use interpersonal neurobiology, so brain science, with how we know the brain heals. And part of how it heals is with narrative. So trauma happens to all of us growing up, even if we had a so-called perfect family. We live in an imperfect world. So something harmful will happen, and we make the best we can with it. We try to make sense of it as children, and we learn to adapt to whatever harm that was to start experiencing the least amount of harm possible. And as we do that, we start to tell a narrative that isn't quite true. And so we start going about life living with these untrue narratives. And what narrative focused trauma care does is it uses a group to speak into a story to help the reader tell a more true story. Because as it is, we don't know what's true because we're living off something that we created as children and we need an outside perspective. And so, as a group speaks truth into the story, a couple things are happening in our brain. One is we're receiving care for the harm that happened in the first place, what we needed in the first place. And we're developing relationships with people. We're feeling felt. And there's something about that human connection of feeling felt, and not just with one person, but with multiple people that can start to change your brain. And as we can tell a more true narrative, different parts of the brain are talking to each other. And so when harm happened, there are parts in our brain that started to fragment to become further apart. But as we tell a story with a narrative, they start coming together. They can talk to each other more easily. So the more cohesive the narrative is, the more true it is, the more we're healed. And the more our brain heals that way, our body can start to relax into life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, something that's very interesting is, this is called the Truth That Heals podcast, but we're getting into these false narratives that people have on life, which can be very damaging and can go on year after year if it's not addressed or it's not healed. So, what are some, perhaps we could say, uh, narratives, false narratives that you have encountered many people holding about themselves, which are damaging?
The biggest one is shame, right? I mean, we're kids and we start to interpret events as I'm bad. And so we start to have this orientation towards the world of I'm bad in my core. And so we develop ways to try to hide our badness. Yeah.
And can you give us an example of how you, as a therapist, how do you, let's say, how do you redirect the client or the person to shift that narrative and build upon this new, more truthful narrative?
Well, there's no one way to do it. There's all these different entry points. So somebody's going to read a story. Okay. They're going to read the story of harm that's happened. And there are sometimes in how they're writing, they're telling more truth than they know. And so it's just a matter of figuring out, well, where do I want to enter the story where I think I can start to nudge them a little bit and start to get them to question their thoughts and their feelings and their beliefs about what happens, and see if I can get them to have a different perspective. But it's really going to depend on the story. And it's really going to depend on where I'm sensing they're going to need healing the most. I wish I could give you a more straightforward answer, but it's so nuanced.
No, that's fine. This is very interesting because it's a totally different approach that I'm used to, and now I'm curious with this narrative building, the storytelling. Is it just like a speech? Are you speaking it, or is it you write down? Are you writing down a story? How does that work?
Yeah. So you're going to write down the story and you're going to want to set it up like you're reading a story. So we're going to want the plot, the characters. We're going to want the scenes, the imagery. If I can get them to remember sounds, textures, uh, anything sensory, we want it to be as if we're in that story in that moment.
Wow, interesting. And what are the benefits of doing this from
Yeah.
what you've
So
seen?
yeah, it's so interesting that when we're writing in that way and we're using all of our senses to remember, we're tapping into body memories. So our body has two ways to remember things. One is implicit memory and one is explicit memory. And so explicit memory is where we can remember what we had for breakfast this morning. And implicit memory is more our body just knows what to do. So we don't have to get up every day and think, well, how do I walk to the kitchen to get my breakfast? We just do it. And so when you write a narrative like that, you're using your explicit memory and your implicit memory. Your body is going to start reacting. If you're reading the story like you're in it, your body will think you're in it too. And that primes you to be in a perfect place to receive care from other people and get the healing that you need.
That's it's this is kind of for me, it resonates so strongly, and it's almost kind of mind blowing actually, because when I started doing this podcast, it actually originated with the blog. I would write down the things that happened. And for those who aren't familiar with my story, I was in a cult for 11 years. There was solitary confinement and things like that. But there was linked to it was so much shame and silence. I couldn't speak. I couldn't have my own narrative because it was intertwined with shame. So I came out with the blog, and little by little I saw myself growing. And then I even did a podcast. But the originality of the podcast, or the I guess the genesis, was for me to tell my story with my narrative, because it had always been the narrative of, like, I guess you could say, the abusers or things like that. And at first it was so terrifying. It was so scary. But I look back and I see myself today, and I'm here with you, host of the Phoenix Effect podcast, and I've seen this growth. How long does it usually take people who take on this approach of building this new truth narrative? How long does it usually take for sessions to last? Is it a 1 day session kind of thing, or could it be longer?
There are different ways to do it. I would say I can do it in an intensive weekend where we have maybe 6 to 7 members and each person takes a turn reading their story twice. That's one way to do it. Or you can do it over a series of weeks. But I would also say we're never done, right? We can do
Mhm.
this one story and we can have that truth spoken in, and our body will start to get a little bit more freedom from whatever style of relating that we've kind of come up with to be in the world. We can start to get a little more choice now if we're not so bound to our former narrative, but we always have more stories. So in one sense, yeah, you can do it one and done in a session, a couple hours, or you can just keep going and do this the rest of your life like me. Whatever way you want to do it.
And is there a science to kind of break down what is the effect of storytelling and how it really opens up the mind to healing?
Yeah, there is some neuroscience. I think Dan Siegel has some stuff about how narrative heals the brain. There's something about it, but we've always done this, right? For as long as we've been people, we've been telling stories. And our ancestors were healing from their trauma as they were passing down their stories. It's like we've always inherently known, I have to tell my story. Yeah.
And what got you so passionate about doing this?
As I was listening to that podcast I told you about, it started to make more sense for me why I was showing up in the world the way that I was. I had been sold a pretty tight story of what a perfect childhood I had. And so I had a lot of shame over showing up in the world with a tendency towards anxiety or eating disorders or depressive tendencies. It wasn't adding up. But as I listened to this podcast host talk to his guests, I realized, oh, wow, there was harm all over the place. I just didn't know how to name it because it was so subtle. And as you listen to other people tell their own stories that were also subtle, you can start to pick up all of the things in your story that are there that might need to be re-examined. It might not be what you have always been told that it was.
Oh, wow. So this has been quite the journey for you, and I'm so happy that you're doing amazing work, I'm sure. And now you have a podcast. Can you introduce us to your podcast? What is it all about?
The Phoenix Effect podcast, I roped two of the people that I worked with in my training to do a podcast with me. I wanted to have people become more familiar with what story work could be in the context of a group. I think a lot of people want to stick with individual therapy or individual healing work with coaches because of that shame that we're talking about. Yeah. But one of the ways that we need to address the shame, one of the ways that we need to heal from shame, one of the most powerful ways to do that is in the context of a group. And so I had the idea, well, if I wrote these people that I know are also amazing storywork coaches, amazing therapists, can they start to hear us talk to each other and get a feel for why this needs to be a group, why this is a group effort, how important it is to have connection and belonging with other people. If it's not just me solo on a podcast, but they're hearing the relationships between me and my co-hosts and how we relate to guests, because how kind of enter into a story is going to be different than how my co-host Kristen enters into a story. And then I have Dennis coming in and he always busts out right at the end with the most amazing things. And so I want them to hear that there are so many ways to do this and everybody has a story and it needs to be told in a group. So that's what we're doing.
Are
Trying
there
to raise
any
awareness. Yeah.
are there any episodes in your podcast that might stick out to you at the moment?
Oh, that's a good question. Because every time I finish one, I want to say that's my favorite one. That's the best one that we've ever done. Hmm. Give me a minute.
Yeah.
Okay. A slight personal favorite when I had my husband on the podcast because I got to hear his story engage with two people that I love and care about because I've been trying to speak into his story for decades. So it was amazing to hear other people speak into him and then get to watch the effect after the podcast was over. I've had so many amazing guests, so many people that come on. And yet, because I know this person very intimately, I got to see him in a different light and I got to see the effect afterwards.
You don't have to get into too many details, but
Yeah.
what was the effect afterwards?
Part of what we learned as we were processing his story is that he does all the work and nobody sees it. And so now I can see how he runs around, he does so much work and how very little credit he gets. And I can understand the heart behind why he's working so hard. I can understand what his heart is needing behind all that work.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And doing a podcast, it is an experience. And I have my podcast, you have your podcast, and it's for me, it's always refreshing to hear other podcasters sharing a bit about the positive side of podcasting. Um, so thank you for that. And now I kind of wanted to take a sidestep and shift onto the importance of connection because I see that in your work, it's also helping people, relationships, building connections, if I'm not mistaken. Can you share with us when you're with a couple, like, how does that work with the narrative? Is it also narrative based? And how do you help the communication, the connection grow stronger?
Great question. I do couples intensives. So we're not going to just show up for 50 minutes. We're going to take several hours. I like to get at least 6, but if people can only do 3, we'll do 3. I will spend the first half just getting to know each of their individual stories. And I want them to hear their partner tell me their story while they're there. So they're listening to it as I'm asking the question so they can start to hear their partner's story in a whole new light. We have to become experts in our partner's story if we want to understand them. And so part of what that does is it's going to help them make sense of how their partner is showing up. And they're going to take so many things less personally when they can hear in context why they would do that, why they keep repeating the same patterns. They start to have so much more empathy for each other. That's not where we stop, but that's definitely where we start.
Yeah, it's a good starting point. And like you mentioned earlier, we're never done. There's always room for growth, improvement, and especially in a relationship. I always see I'm single. I've been single, but the way I see love is it should be like a crescendo. It should hopefully grow and grow continuously. But the truth is there are many challenges. So um so with this work that you do, now I'm kind of curious, what do you think hinders couples from hearing each other and then leading them to, of course, come to you for help?
You ask such great questions. I think it's what's happening in their story that they're unaware of, their own unconscious wounds that are playing out that they have not addressed yet. Anything that's happening in our life that's causing, well, I wouldn't say anything. Most things in our life that are causing us frustration can almost always be tied back to an unhealed wound in our story. And it's just asking for a little bit of attention.
Mm. So that was beautiful. And I have to think of questions on the go.
You're doing fine. Yeah.
So now I kind of wanted to go back into your podcast. I know I'm kind of jumping from one area to the other, but I see that they're so closely connected. Now that you're doing the podcast, can you give us a little bit of a background with the title? Because it's an awesome title, and also it's an awesome logo that you have.
Thank you. All the titles that I was coming up with were taken, and it was super frustrating. I would come up with what I think was so brilliant and so unique, and then I put it into Apple Podcasts and somebody had taken it. And I think I might have tried to put things into Chat GPT, things like that. But there was something at one point in Chat GPT and our hours long discussion, me and Chat GPT, and they mentioned the word Phoenix. And I have a therapy dog named Phoenix. And I'm like, that maybe that's it. So also a Harry Potter fan. Yeah. So in Harry Potter, there is a bird that is meant to heal people with their tears. And that's why I named my dog that. And there's something about the process of the phoenix that as it dies, it's reborn. And I just think that's a really powerful symbol of the healing work that we're all trying to do is when we look at these stories, there's a part of us that has to die. And at the same time, we're being reborn into a stronger, better version of ourselves.
I think that's I think one of the most difficult parts of the healing journey for me is allowing a part to die, because before I started my journey of, writing my blogs, writing or doing the podcast, there was a lot of fear, and a part of me didn't want to grow. A part of me felt comfortable just living life kind of passively. Um, but now that I'm in this, I guess I could say the old me has died. I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm articulating my feelings correctly, but now that I feel that like that old side of me has kind of died off, that side of me that was full of shame and I couldn't open up. And now that I'm in this new, I guess, new life, it does feel like I guess the Phoenix does connect a lot. Actually, it's funny you bring up the Phoenix, because people were messaging me at the inception of this podcast, and we're saying, Ryan, you got to do the Phoenix. I'll do your logo. And I was like, no, I'm not. I don't know. I don't know how to do it. But the Phoenix, the story, the healing, the death, the rebirth, it does have a lot of symbolism. So that's why I'm very attracted to your podcast and to all that you have to say.
Thank you for sharing that. When I say part of us needs to die, I think I'm referring to all the ways that we've learned to protect ourselves. And so, as you were talking about your story, you mentioned the word passivity. And so that just tells me a very young Ryan at one point found if I'm passive, that's going to keep me safe. And so, as you're going throughout your journey of healing, you're starting to be able to play with and have some room with that and find out, well, maybe I don't always need to be passive.
Oh no,
Yeah.
I'm very active.
Okay.
I'm very active now with life and trying to live life to the full. And living life to the full doesn't mean uh getting drunk and partying all the time. It just means living life, seeing what are one's gifts, one's strengths, acknowledging one's weaknesses, and being okay with it, and going forward and living the best you can. And that's what I'm trying my best to do, even though it's very scary at times. And I feel like with the old narrative, Oh, Ryan, you can't do that. You can't invite Elle to your podcast. Who are you? You aren't an expert. I mean, these are things that kind of stay with the person. And even though I've gone through my own therapy and trying to get healing, but I feel that I have more tools and a new narrative to kind of override that old side of me.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel that too, right?
Yeah.
Those old stories. Who am I to feel like I have authority to talk about anything? And then
But
you learn to push through the discomfort. Like, well, let's just see what happens, right?
yeah, and it's opened so many doors, and it's opened this opportunity for me to write on threads. At first I was scared, so I had to ask AI to kind of help me write. I mean, because when someone doesn't have confidence in themselves, it's okay to ask for help. I've learned that it's okay. Maybe I'm not the most well versed in writing little scripts or little tweets or things like that, but it's okay to ask for help. So I asked AI to help me out, write something short and sweet. And here we are connected on the podcast. And so thank you for thank you for taking my offer and for being here.
You're very welcome.
And to kind of start wrapping things up, I like to ask a question to all of my guests, and that is what is your truth that heals?
I love that question. We are wounded in relationship and we are healed in relationship. And that's something I feel very deeply in my body. I wouldn't be able to sit here and talk with you if I hadn't had people speak into my life and told me that I have something important to say after a lifetime of being silenced. It was the people that changed me. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Elle. And to finally come to a close, if you have any links that you would like to share with the audience, share your podcast, can you share them now?
Yes, you can find me at my website, courageousstepscounseling.com. And we are the Phoenix Effect Podcast. We are wherever you listen to podcasts.
So go check out the Phoenix Effect podcast. Listeners, go check it out, subscribe. And by chance, do you have a YouTube?
I do. I forgot. Thank you. You can find us on YouTube.
Okay.
The Phoenix Effect Podcast has a web channel. Thank you for the reminder.
All right, subscribe to her YouTube channel for the Phoenix Effect. And again, Elle, thank you for being here on the Truth That Heals podcast.
Thanks for having me.